In 1851, on the night before Christmas, a fire broke out inside the United States Capitol building. By morning, roughly 35,000 volumes had turned to ash, including two-thirds of Thomas Jefferson's personal library, a collection of about 6,500 books that he had painstakingly assembled over a lifetime and sold to Congress in 1815. The official explanation was a faulty chimney flue. A chimney flue in one of the most closely guarded buildings in America. And yet, here is the detail that rarely gets mentioned. Among the volumes lost were Jefferson's private annotations, margin notes where one of the nation's founders recorded his personal reflections on governance, ancient history, and what he called the forgotten sciences. Those notes have never been recovered. No copies existed. The man's private intellectual world, committed to the margins of thousands of pages, simply vanished in a single night. Was this truly an accident of soot and timber, or does it strike you as something far more convenient? Welcome to Epoch Reset. If you are new here, this is where we investigate the things that official history prefers you never ask about. Today, we are opening a door that has been quietly locked for over a century. We call it the Forbidden Shelf. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and leave a comment below telling me this. Have you ever searched for a book in a library catalog, found the listing, walked to the shelf, and discovered the book simply was not there? If that has happened to you, stay with me, because what we are about to uncover may explain why. And later in this video, I am going to show you something about one of the wealthiest families in modern history, and the private archive they have kept under restricted access for generations. That detail alone changes everything. Let us begin with a simple premise. The 19th century was the age of the printing press at industrial scale. For the first time in human history, books could be produced by the thousands, cheaply and quickly. Knowledge, in theory, was becoming democratized. Anyone with a few coins could walk into a bookshop and buy a volume on science, philosophy, or history. The old monopoly of the church and the aristocracy over information appeared to be crumbling. And yet, if you look carefully at what actually survived from that era, what is physically present on library shelves today versus what the catalogs of the time say should be there, a strange picture emerges. There are gaps, not random gaps, not the kind of natural attrition you would expect from age and wear. These are surgical gaps. Specific subjects, specific authors, specific editions, quietly absent from the record. Now some will say this is simply the nature of time. Books decay, libraries flood, fires happen. And of course, all of that is true. But the pattern we are going to trace today suggests something more deliberate. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but something arguably worse. A quiet, methodical, almost bureaucratic process of deciding which ideas the public would be allowed to remember and which would be gently, permanently removed from reach. The 19th century was not merely the age of print, it was the age of the catalog, and whoever controlled the catalog controlled what people believed existed at all. If a book is not in the index, not in the register, not on the shelf, then for all practical purposes, it was never written. The knowledge never existed. That is the power we are dealing with. Not the dramatic burning of a library in some ancient war, but the quiet, clerical erasure of entries from a ledger. A line crossed out, a card removed from a drawer, a volume marked as lost in transit and never replaced. And the people who understood this best were not generals or kings. They were librarians, censors, postal inspectors, and the private collectors who could afford to buy what the public would never be allowed to see. We are going to meet some of these figures today, trace their methods, and ask questions that, even now, do not have satisfying answers. But first, consider something that will frame everything else we discuss. In the 19th century, the act of publishing a book was also the act of creating a record. Every print run had a size. Every shipment had a manifest. Every library had a register. In theory, you could trace a single volume from the press to the shelf. In practice, those chains of custody were broken with astonishing regularity, always at the most inconvenient moments, and always affecting the most inconvenient texts. Let us talk about what the 19th century considered dangerous. Not political pamphlets or revolutionary manifestos, though those were certainly targeted. The truly dangerous texts were subtler. Books that challenged the agreed-upon version of the past. Historical chronicles that contradicted official timelines. Maps that showed geographical knowledge supposedly not yet discovered. Technical treatises describing methods and machines that, according to the accepted narrative, should not have existed when they were written. The historical record suggests that the suppression of such texts was not the work of a single shadowy organization, but rather the convergent behavior of multiple powerful institutions, each acting to protect its own version of truth. The Church had its mechanisms. The state had its own. And the new industrial elite, the banking families and railroad barons, they had the most effective mechanism of all: money. The ability to simply buy a text out of circulation and place it behind a locked door where no scholar would ever read it again. What does not add up is how often these different mechanisms seem to have targeted the same texts. When a book appears on a Vatican prohibition list and also vanishes from a government library and also surfaces decades later in the private vault of a banking dynasty, we are no longer looking at coincidence. We are looking at a system. Perhaps not coordinated, perhaps not one with a chairman and a meeting schedule, but a system nonetheless. And the 19th century provided the perfect cover. In the age of industrial printing, books were produced in such enormous quantities that the loss of a few hundred copies would hardly be noticed. The very abundance of print made selective erasure almost invisible. The more books there were, the easier it became to make specific ones disappear. Now let us look at the machinery of suppression in concrete terms, because this was not theoretical. Real people held real positions of power, and they used that power to systematically decide what the public was allowed to read. Consider Anthony Comstock. In 1873, the United States Congress passed what became known as the Comstock Act, a federal law that made it illegal to send obscene, lewd, or lascivious material through the mail. On its surface, this sounded like a moral crusade, a Victorian attempt to protect delicate sensibilities. But the man behind it, Anthony Comstock, a self-appointed guardian of public morals who served as a United States postal inspector, interpreted his mandate with extraordinary breadth. Over the course of his career, Comstock personally oversaw the destruction of 15 tons of books. Let that settle in your mind. 15 tons. He also destroyed 284,000 pounds of printing plates, the metal molds used to produce books, which meant that not only were existing copies eliminated, but the very ability to reprint those texts was permanently removed. And nearly 4 million pictures were confiscated and destroyed under his authority. Now, the official narrative frames Comstock as a prudish moralist burning pornography and quack medical pamphlets. And certainly some of what he destroyed fell into those categories. But researchers who have examined the fragmentary records of his confiscations note that the seized materials also included texts on anatomy, reproductive science, alternative medical theories, and what were broadly classified as free-thought publications, works that questioned religious orthodoxy and, in some cases, the established historical narrative. The categories were conveniently vague. Obscene could mean almost anything. And once a book was seized and its plates destroyed, there was no appeal, no review, no public accounting of exactly what had been lost. Think about what it means to destroy printing plates. A book can be reprinted as long as the plates survive. The plates are the memory. The book is just the expression. When you melt down 284,000 pounds of printing plates, you are performing a kind of intellectual lobotomy, removing the capacity of a society to reproduce certain thoughts. The record suggests that detailed inventories of confiscated materials were either never kept or did not survive. Convenient, would you not say? But Comstock was merely the American chapter of a much larger story. Across the Atlantic, the Vatican had been running its own system of intellectual control for centuries, and in the 19th century it was still in full operation. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, was a list maintained by the Catholic Church from 1560 all the way to 1966. For over 400 years, this official register dictated which books Catholics were forbidden to read, possess, or sell. The list included thousands of titles, and among the banned authors were some of the greatest minds in Western history: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, and many others. In the 19th century, the Index was not merely a symbolic document. In countries where the Church held significant political influence, being placed on the Index could effectively end a book's commercial life. Booksellers could face excommunication, and in an age when religious identity was deeply intertwined with social standing, few were willing to be seen purchasing a prohibited text. Entire bodies of scientific and philosophical work were functionally erased from public discourse in large parts of Europe, not by burning them in a bonfire, but by making it socially and economically ruinous to engage with them. What does not add up is the timing of certain additions to the Index during the 19th century. Some of the texts banned were not new works pushing radical ideas. They were older texts, some dating back centuries, that had circulated without issue for generations before suddenly being deemed dangerous. Why would the Church move to suppress a 200-year-old treatise on natural philosophy? Some historians suggest that it was not the content that suddenly became threatening, but the context. In an age of mass literacy and cheap printing, ideas safely contained within elite academic circles were now at risk of reaching the general public. And then there is the curious case of Thomas Bowdler, whose contribution to the suppression of knowledge was arguably more insidious because it was disguised as improvement. In 1818, Bowdler published what he called the Family Shakespeare, an edition of the playwright's complete works from which he had carefully removed every passage he considered inappropriate. This gave rise to the term Bowdlerize, which entered the English language as a verb, meaning to censor or remove sensitive content from texts. But here is what is often overlooked. Bowdler did not merely edit Shakespeare, he set a precedent. He demonstrated that a text could be altered, presented as complete, and sold to a public that would never know what had been removed. And this technique, the silent editorial amputation, became one of the most powerful tools of 19th century censorship. How many revised editions and updated compilations from the 1800s were, in fact, Bowdlerized versions of earlier texts with inconvenient passages quietly excised? Some bibliographers who have compared first editions with later printings of the same works have found discrepancies that go far beyond simple editing for clarity. Entire chapters vanish between editions. Maps lose certain annotations. Technical diagrams are simplified to the point of uselessness, and in every case the later edition is presented as authoritative, while the earlier, more complete version gradually disappears from circulation, replaced on library shelves by the sanitized version. What do you think is really going on here? Does the simplest explanation satisfy you, that these were all independent acts of moral guardianship by well-meaning Victorians? Or does this feel like something that was carefully coordinated? I am not asking you to accept any particular theory. I am asking you to look at the pattern and tell me in the comments whether you think the pattern is accidental. Because the pattern extends far beyond books of philosophy and literature. It reaches into the very infrastructure of knowledge itself, into the libraries and museums that were supposed to be the permanent repositories of human achievement. And that is where things become truly unsettling. Let us return to that fire on the night before Christmas in 1851. The Library of Congress blaze destroyed roughly 35,000 of the approximately 55,000 volumes held at the time. The fire was devastating not just in scale, but in specificity. Jefferson's collection, which had formed the intellectual backbone of the library, was disproportionately affected. These were not ordinary books. Jefferson had spent decades assembling what was arguably the most important private library in America, a collection that reflected his voracious curiosity about science, history, ancient languages, architecture, agriculture, and what he called the useful arts. Many of the volumes contained his personal annotations, marginal notes that recorded his interpretations, his doubts, his connections between disparate fields of knowledge. When those books burned, it was not just paper that was lost. It was the private intellectual architecture of one of the most brilliant minds of the American founding. The official investigation attributed the fire to a chimney flue, and perhaps that is exactly what happened. But what the official account tends to gloss over is the political context. By 1851, the United States was a decade away from civil war. Jefferson's library contained texts on governance, natural rights, and the philosophical foundations of the Republic that were being actively cited by both sides of the political divide. The fire eliminated the need for anyone to argue about whether those texts should remain accessible. They simply ceased to exist. I am not saying the fire was deliberately set. The evidence does not support that claim. What I am saying is that the consequences were remarkably convenient for those who preferred that certain lines of thought remain inaccessible. While the library was rebuilt and restocked, many lost volumes were never replaced. Editions common in 1815 were, by 1851, already scarce, and Jefferson's personal annotations could not be reconstructed. The official record was reconstituted. The unofficial personal annotated record, the one that might have told us what Jefferson really thought, disappeared permanently. Now cross the Atlantic, and the story becomes even more troubling. The British Museum, which later evolved into the British Library, held one of the largest collections of printed material in the world. Under legal deposit rights that had been formalized since 1662, the British Museum was entitled to receive a copy of every book published in the United Kingdom. Every single one. In theory, this meant that the museum's collection was a complete mirror of everything that had been printed in the English-speaking world. In practice, as multiple audits over the centuries revealed, the collection had persistent and unexplained gaps. Over 9,000 books have been reported missing from the British Library's holdings. 9,000. Among them are Renaissance treatises on theology and alchemy, medieval manuscripts, and early scientific texts that exist nowhere else. Many of these disappearances were documented during the move from the British Museum's original reading room to the new facility at St. Pancras in 1998. But here is what the record suggests. The losses did not begin with the move. Auditors and librarians had been flagging discrepancies between the catalog and the physical holdings for decades before that. Books that were listed in the catalog, that had accession numbers and shelf marks, were simply not there when someone went to retrieve them. Not misshelved, not misfiled. Gone. What makes this puzzling is the security context. Many of the missing items were rare books held in restricted access areas. Retrieving them required formal requests, supervised reading rooms, and detailed logs. And yet the books vanished anyway. Some former staff members have suggested in interviews and memoirs that the scale indicates something beyond ordinary theft or mismanagement. A single stolen book is a crime. 9,000 missing books begins to look like something else entirely. What we cannot confirm, but what several independent researchers have noted, is that the missing titles cluster around certain subjects. Texts on alchemy, early chemistry, heterodox theology, pre-Columbian geography, and what might broadly be called alternative histories of civilization are disproportionately represented among the losses. If the disappearances were random, you would expect them to reflect the general composition of the collection. They do not. The pattern is skewed, and the skew consistently favors the removal of texts that challenge conventional narratives. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. If you were a researcher in the 19th century, working on a topic that powerful institutions preferred to remain unexplored, how would you even know that relevant texts had been removed? You would go to the catalog, find no listing, and conclude that no such text existed. The absence of evidence would become, in your mind, evidence of absence. You would build your understanding of history on the assumption that the catalog was complete, never suspecting that the catalog itself had been curated to shape what you would find. This is the genius of archival suppression. It does not require you to lie. It merely requires you to control what truth is available. If this is making you rethink how you look at official historical records, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. Make sure you have subscribed to Epoch Reset so you do not miss what comes next, because we are about to enter the private vaults of some of the wealthiest and most powerful families in modern history. And what they collected and what they kept locked away may be the most revealing part of this entire investigation. While public libraries were losing books at an alarming rate, a parallel world of private collecting was thriving. And the men who built these private libraries were not sentimental bibliophiles hoarding first editions for the love of literature. They were some of the most powerful financiers and industrialists of the age, men who understood that information was the most valuable commodity of all. Consider J.P. Morgan. In 1906, Morgan completed construction of a private library next to his New York City mansion, a building designed not as a reading room, but as a vault. The structure was built with extraordinary security for its time, fireproof, climate-controlled, and accessible only to Morgan himself and his trusted librarian, Belle da Costa Green. Green was one of the most remarkable figures in the history of book collecting, a woman of extraordinary intellect and discretion who managed Morgan's collection for decades and who, by all accounts, knew more about its contents than anyone alive. What Morgan collected was not merely rare, it was strategic. Ancient manuscripts, medieval texts, early printed books, maps, scientific treatises, letters from historical figures, documents that recorded deals, treaties, and arrangements that the parties involved had every reason to want forgotten. The Morgan Library, now a public museum, still holds a vast collection of such materials. But researchers who have worked with the collection have noted that certain categories of material remain difficult to access, restricted by conditions of donation or by institutional policy. What Morgan collected during his lifetime and what he specifically sought out offers a window into what the most powerful man in American finance considered worth owning and worth controlling. Some sources claim that Morgan's agents were active at book auctions across Europe, systematically acquiring texts that were being deaccessioned from public and ecclesiastical libraries. If a monastery was selling off its holdings, Morgan's people were often there. If a university library was disposing of duplicates, Morgan's agents would examine the lots before they reached the open market. The question that naturally arises is, what was he looking for? What specific categories of knowledge did one of the world's most powerful financiers consider so valuable that he built a personal fortress to house them? The official account of the Morgan Library emphasizes the aesthetic and cultural value of the collection. Illuminated manuscripts, fine bindings, literary masterpieces. But former researchers and visiting scholars have observed, in published memoirs and academic papers, that the collection also includes materials of a different character. Technical documents, engineering treatises, maps with annotations that do not correspond to any known cartographic tradition. Their presence in a collection assembled by one of the most strategically minded men in financial history is, at minimum, curious. And Morgan was not alone. The Rothschild family, whose banking empire spanned Europe from the late 18th century onward, maintained extensive private libraries and archives across multiple countries. The Rothschild Archive, which contains materials dating from the 1700s forward, has been partially opened to researchers in recent decades, but significant portions remain under restricted access. With branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, the Rothschilds had access to book markets across the entire continent. They could acquire materials in any language, from any country, and store them in private residences where no public catalog would ever list them. What is striking about the Rothschild collections is not merely their size, but their scope. These were not narrow collections focused on a single subject or period. They encompassed history, science, cartography, theology, law, and what might be called intelligence, the kind of information that gives its possessor an advantage in understanding the true shape of political and economic power. Some historians of the family have suggested that the libraries served a dual purpose: cultural prestige on the one hand and strategic information advantage on the other. Now, I want to be careful here. The record suggests that during the 19th century, there was a significant transfer of rare and unique texts from public and ecclesiastical collections into private hands. This transfer was legal, often conducted through legitimate auctions and sales. But its cumulative effect was to concentrate certain categories of knowledge in the hands of a very small number of very wealthy individuals, while public institutions became progressively more incomplete. Is it possible that this was simply the free market at work? Of course. But the specificity of what was collected, the overlap between what disappeared from public libraries and what appeared in private vaults, and the restrictions placed on access to these collections all suggest something more purposeful than mere bibliophilia. What do you think? Were these collectors simply indulging a passion, or were they engaged in something that looks very much like the privatization of forbidden knowledge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of question that deserves more voices than just mine. And there is another dimension to this that we have not yet explored: the role of the state. Because while private collectors were acquiring texts through purchase, governments had a far more direct tool at their disposal. They had censorship. And in the 19th century, no government wielded this tool more aggressively or more effectively than the Russian Empire. But before we get to Russia, I want to point out something that connects the private collectors to the state censors in a way that is rarely discussed. The same texts that were being banned or suppressed by government agencies were often the same texts that were appearing in the private libraries of the ultra-wealthy. It is as if the public suppression created a scarcity that made these texts more valuable on the private market, and the collectors who acquired them benefited from the very censorship that made the texts unavailable to everyone else. Whether this was coordinated or merely opportunistic is a question worth holding in mind as we continue. In 1826, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia established the third section of his imperial chancellery. On paper, this was an administrative office. In practice, it was a secret police force with broad authority over internal security, and one of its primary functions was the supervision of censorship. The third section did not merely ban books. It monitored authors, tracked the movement of manuscripts, intercepted correspondence, and maintained a network of informants within the publishing industry. If you were a writer in 19th century Russia, the third section knew what you were working on before your publisher did. The Russian censorship apparatus of this period was remarkable, not for its brutality, but for its sophistication. The censors understood that simply banning a book often increased public interest. So they developed subtler methods. Texts could be approved for publication, but with specific passages removed so skillfully that readers would never know anything was missing. Authors could be permitted to publish only through approved presses that quietly altered text during typesetting. And in some cases, books were printed, but then purchased in bulk by government agents who removed them from the market before they reached bookshops. The print run would be recorded. The sales records would show distribution, but the actual books would not exist in any accessible location. Alexander Herzen, one of the most important Russian political thinkers of the 19th century, understood this system intimately, which is why in 1853 he established the Free Russian Press in London, beyond the reach of the Tsar's censors. From London, Herzen printed and smuggled into Russia texts that the third section had suppressed: political philosophy, historical analysis, and what he called the true chronicle of our nation, accounts of Russian history that contradicted the state-approved version. What is fascinating about Herzen's operation is what it reveals about the scope of Russian censorship. He was not merely printing political pamphlets. Among the materials he published were historical documents, old chronicles, and administrative records that had been removed from Russian archives and libraries. These were not revolutionary texts in the traditional sense. They were records of the past, accounts of events that the government preferred to frame differently or not acknowledge at all. The fact that historical documents required smuggling out of the country and printing on foreign presses tells us something profound about what the Russian state considered dangerous, not just dissent, but memory itself. And Russia was not unique in this regard, merely more overt. Across Europe, the 19th century saw governments developing increasingly sophisticated systems for managing what their populations were allowed to know about the past. In France, the aftermath of the Revolution produced a sustained effort to control the historical narrative, with archives reorganized and certain collections placed under military guard. In the German states, the rise of nationalism was accompanied by efforts to construct a particular version of Germanic history, which involved suppressing evidence that contradicted the desired narrative. The British approach was, characteristically, more subtle. Rather than banning books outright, the British system relied on a combination of social pressure, economic incentives, and institutional gatekeeping. The legal deposit system, which required publishers to submit copies of every book to the British Museum, was theoretically a mechanism for preservation. But it also served as a mechanism for surveillance. The authorities knew exactly what was being published, who was publishing it, and how many copies existed. And as we have already discussed, the gap between what was deposited and what could later be found on the shelves suggests that the deposit system may have served a dual purpose: cataloging knowledge so that specific items could be identified for removal. Now something else demands our attention here, a figure who sits at the intersection of preservation and control in a way that perfectly illustrates the ambiguity of this entire story. Antonio Panizzi was an Italian political refugee who fled to England after participating in revolutionary activities in his homeland. He eventually rose to become principal librarian of the British Museum, one of the most powerful positions in the world of institutional knowledge. In 1841, Panizzi created a set of 91 rules for standardizing book cataloging, a system that became the foundation for modern library cataloging worldwide. On one level, Panizzi was a hero of knowledge, a man who imposed order on chaos and made it possible for anyone to find any book in a vast collection. But there is another way to read his achievement. Standardized cataloging also meant standardized control. If you control the rules by which books are categorized, described, and indexed, you also control what is findable and what is not. A book that is cataloged under the wrong subject heading is effectively invisible to anyone searching by topic. A book whose catalog entry contains a subtle error in the title or author name becomes a ghost, present in the collection but absent from any search. And a book whose catalog entry is simply never created, despite the physical volume sitting on a shelf, exists in a kind of limbo, materially real, but institutionally non-existent. I am not suggesting that Panizzi designed his system for the purpose of concealment. The evidence does not support that. What I am suggesting is that any system powerful enough to organize all of human knowledge is also powerful enough to hide parts of it. And in the hands of those who came after Panizzi, the catalog became both a map and a maze, a tool for finding and a tool for losing. Does this feel like the kind of conversation that more people should be having? If so, drop a comment and share this video with someone who questions the completeness of what we are told about the past. The algorithm only shows this to more people if you engage with it, and this story deserves to be heard. We have talked about the burners, the banners, the buyers, and the bureaucrats. Now let us talk about the paper trail itself, because this is where the story becomes most unsettling. The 19th century left behind an enormous documentary record, publisher catalogs, library registers, shipping manifests, customs declarations, bookseller inventories, auction records. In theory, you can trace the life of a book from the moment the manuscript left the author's hand to the moment a reader opened it in a library or a private study. In practice, those trails are broken with a consistency that defies statistical probability. Let us start with the publisher catalogs. In the 19th century, major publishers issued annual or semi-annual catalogs listing every title they had in print. These catalogs were widely distributed to booksellers and libraries. They are, in effect, a snapshot of what was available at any given moment. And when you compare these catalogs year over year, you find something peculiar. Titles appear in one year's catalog and vanish from the next with no explanation. Not out of print, which would be noted. Not replaced by a new edition, which would also be noted. Simply gone, as if they had never been listed. Now, publisher catalogs do contain errors. Titles are sometimes listed before they are actually printed or carried over from previous catalogs after they have gone out of print. But the pattern of unexplained disappearances is not random. Researchers who have systematically compared these catalogs have found that the vanishing titles cluster around specific subjects: ancient history, pre-modern technology, alternative chronologies, and what might be broadly termed esoteric knowledge. Texts on cookery and gardening and popular fiction remain stable from year to year. Texts on the subjects we have been discussing show a markedly higher rate of unexplained disappearance. Then there are the shipping manifests. In an age when books were transported by ship, rail, and horse-drawn wagon, losses in transit were not uncommon. Crates fell off wagons, ships sank, warehouses flooded. But the frequency with which certain shipments were lost is, to put it diplomatically, statistically remarkable. Some sources claim that specific print runs, particularly of texts that had attracted the attention of religious or governmental censors, suffered loss rates far above the average. A publisher might ship 500 copies of a controversial text and have only 50 arrive at their destination, while a shipment of popular novels sent on the same route at the same time arrived complete. The shipping companies' records, where they survive, attribute these losses to weather, road conditions, or simple misrouting. But the pattern is difficult to explain by weather alone. The re-edition problem is perhaps the most insidious. Throughout the 19th century, it was common practice to issue new editions of important reference works, encyclopedias, histories, scientific compendia. Each new edition was presented as an improvement over the last, updated with the latest knowledge and corrected for errors. And indeed, many new editions were genuine improvements. But some, when compared carefully with their predecessors, reveal a different kind of revision. Passages are shortened, details are removed, maps lose their annotations, technical descriptions become vague where they were once precise, and the earlier editions, the ones with the complete information, gradually disappear from library shelves, replaced by the newer, sanitized version. This is Bowdlerization on an industrial scale, not of Shakespeare, but of the historical and scientific record itself. And it was done so gradually, so quietly, that no single change was dramatic enough to attract attention. Each new edition was just slightly less informative than the last. Over the course of several decades, a text that had once contained detailed and specific information about, say, an ancient technology or a pre-modern navigational technique would be reduced to vague generalities that told the reader nothing useful. The catalog discrepancy problem extends to every major library of the 19th century. We have already discussed the British Museum, but the phenomenon was not limited to Britain. In France, the Bibliothèque Nationale experienced similar gaps between catalog and collection. In the German-speaking world, university libraries reported persistent discrepancies. In the United States, the Smithsonian Institution struggled throughout the century with unexplained losses of donated materials. What makes these discrepancies so troubling is their resistance to explanation. Libraries are controlled environments, books are checked in and out, access is monitored, inventories are conducted, and yet the books disappear anyway. Not in ones and twos, which could be attributed to theft, but in thousands, which suggests something systemic. When the British Library reported over 9,000 missing books, the scale of the loss was too large for petty theft and too specific in its subject distribution for random mismanagement. Antonio Panizzi's cataloging system, for all its brilliance, inadvertently created the perfect tool for identifying precisely this kind of gap. Because the catalog was so detailed, so specific in its descriptions, any discrepancy between the catalog entry and the physical reality of the shelf became glaringly obvious, at least to those who were looking. The question is, how many people were looking? In the 19th century, access to the catalog itself was often restricted. You could not simply walk into the British Museum and browse the complete catalog. You needed to submit a request, which was reviewed by library staff, who would then retrieve the requested item if it existed. If the book was listed as missing, you would be told it was unavailable. You would have no way of knowing whether it was temporarily misplaced or permanently gone. The system was designed for efficiency, but it also created an information asymmetry that made it almost impossible for ordinary users to detect patterns of disappearance. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound aspect of the entire forbidden shelf phenomenon, the relationship between knowledge and power in the age of print. The 19th century is celebrated as the era when knowledge was democratized, when the combination of mass literacy and cheap printing made information available to everyone. And that is partially true. The average citizen of 1890 had access to more books, more newspapers, more information of all kinds than the average citizen of 1790. But what we have been exploring today suggests that this democratization was carefully managed. The public was given access to an enormous quantity of information, but the quality and completeness of that information was curated by institutions and individuals who had strong incentives to shape what the public knew about the past. This is not the crude censorship of a dictator burning books in a public square. This is something far more sophisticated. The gentle, persistent, almost invisible editing of the available record, conducted over decades by people who understood that the most effective way to control what people think is to control what people can find. Not what they are allowed to read, because outright bans attract attention, but what physically exists on the shelves they have access to. And the 19th century was the critical period for this process, because it was the last era in which such control was practically possible. Before mass printing, knowledge was so scarce that its control was relatively simple. After the digital revolution, knowledge became so abundant and so distributed that centralized control became nearly impossible. But in the 19th century, the window was open. There was enough printing to create the illusion of universal access, but the distribution channels were still centralized enough to allow selective removal. We may never know the full extent of what was lost. By definition, successfully suppressed knowledge leaves no trace of its own suppression. The books that are missing from the shelves are also missing from our awareness. We do not mourn what we do not know existed. And that, perhaps, is the deepest tragedy of the forbidden shelf. Not the knowledge that was lost, but the questions that were never asked, because the evidence that would have prompted them had been quietly, methodically removed. So, where does this leave us? We have walked through the 19th century's machinery of suppression, from Comstock's bonfires to the Vatican's index, from Bowdler's editorial scalpel to the third section's secret police. We have seen how public libraries lost thousands of volumes under circumstances that strain the credibility of innocent explanation. We have looked behind the doors of private collectors whose wealth gave them the power to buy what the public would never be permitted to see. And we have traced the paper trail, or rather the gaps in it, that suggest a systematic and sustained effort to shape what humanity was allowed to remember about its own past. But I want to end not with a conclusion, but with a question. Because the real power of this story is not in any single fact or any single missing book. It is in the pattern, and patterns require your participation to interpret. Consider this. We live in an age when more information is available than ever before. Digitization projects have put millions of pages online, and yet, even now, there are gaps. Digitization is not random. Someone decides which text to scan first, which to prioritize, and which to leave for later. Later sometimes means never. The texts most likely to be digitized are the ones already well known, already part of the accepted canon. The obscure, the unusual, the inconvenient. These tend to remain in physical form, vulnerable to all the hazards of time, water, fire, and quiet removal. The 19th century story we have told today is not merely historical. It is a template. The methods have changed, but the incentives have not. The printing press merely industrialized the process of selective erasure. The digital revolution has complicated it, but it has not ended it. What can we do? We can look. We can compare catalogs with shelves, digital records with physical holdings, official histories with primary sources. Why is this text listed but not available? Why does this edition differ from the one it claims to replace? These are not conspiracy theories. They are research questions. Let me leave you with one final detail that captures the essence of everything we have discussed. In the British Museum's catalogue, compiled under the system Antonio Panizzi designed, there are entries for books that no living person has ever seen. The catalogue describes them. It gives their titles, their authors, their dates of publication, their physical dimensions. Everything is documented except their physical existence. They are listed, but they are not there. They have been not there for a very long time, and no one can explain where they went. Are these simply clerical errors, phantom entries created by a cataloger's mistake? Perhaps. That is the simplest explanation, and simple explanations deserve respect. But when the phantom entries cluster around certain subjects, when they appear in the same categories as the books we know were suppressed, when they describe texts that, if they existed, would challenge narratives that powerful institutions have spent centuries constructing, then the simplest explanation begins to feel less like wisdom and more like willful naivete. The forbidden shelf is not a place. It is a condition. It is the state of knowing that something is missing, but being unable to prove what it was. It is the gap between the catalog and the collection, between the history we are told and the history that was lived, between the knowledge that survived and the knowledge that someone decided should not. Thank you for staying with me through this. If this video made you think, made you question, made you want to dig deeper, then it has done its job. Leave me a comment with your thoughts. Tell me what you think was on the forbidden shelf. Tell me which of these stories surprised you most. This channel exists because of conversations like the ones we have in the comments, and every perspective adds to the picture. If you have not subscribed to Epoch Reset, now is the time. We are going deeper into these questions in coming videos, and what we have planned next builds directly on what we explored today. Until then, keep looking, keep questioning, and remember, the most dangerous thing about a missing book is not what it contained, but that you will never know to look for it. This is Epoch Reset. See you in the next one. C.